Hey guys, tonight we find ourselves standing in a dusty medieval courtyard, the sky slowly turning purple as twilight sets in. You can hear the clank of armor echoing softly from the training grounds, the scent of horses and leather mixing gently with smoke from the evening fires. But let's get real. If you actually lived here, chances are you probably wouldn't survive the hygiene, let alone the sword training. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're watching from tonight and what time it is there. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You were born into the humble village of Eldergrove, nestled beside dense forests that whispered secrets in the evening breeze. Your childhood was simpler than simple, framed by mud-caked feet, laughter under the apple trees, and warm porridge eaten quickly before chores. Your father was a woodcutter, your mother an herbalist. Neither profession offered much in the way of coin or prestige, but they taught you resilience, resourcefulness, and respect for the land. The village was small enough that everyone knew each other's names, their dogs, and exactly who owed whom a sack of flour. Nights were spent around crackling fires as elders spun tales of knights, dragons, and far-off lands, so vividly real you could taste the steel of swords and smell the sulfur of dragon's breath. Each word settled in your young mind, fueling dreams you barely understood but passionately wanted to chase. It was during one of those chilly nights, wrapped in scratchy wool blankets and huddled near glowing embers, that your dream took firm root. A wandering knight, a rarity in your little corner of nowhere, paused in Eldergrove on his travels. His armor gleamed by firelight, his stories richer than any bard could conjure. He spoke of chivalry, honor, and battles fought under banners snapping in the wind. You sat eye wide, hanging on every word, and knew instantly this was your destiny. But even dreaming of knighthood cost dearly. Realistically, it meant leaving home, trading comfort for hardship, trading family for uncertain companionship. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants genuinely aspired to rise in rank, or whether this narrative is merely romanticized. But for you, as clear as the constellations that mapped your future above, it was undeniable. Your journey was about to begin, and it would cost more than coin. It would demand patience, sweat, and likely embarrassing mishaps along the way. Ever heard about medieval toothpaste? Usually made from ashes and herbs. Not exactly minty fresh. You'd learn to cope, laugh, and press onward, forever dreaming of knighthood despite these humorous hurdles. As night descended fully, your eyes drifted shut, mind alive with visions of battles yet fought, armor yet worn, and honor yet earned. Your path to becoming a knight was just beginning, and every great story, yours included, started in humble dust.
Your journey to knighthood truly began in front of a crackling fireplace, not far from the same village where your dreams were born. The heat from the fire warmed your face, casting dancing shadows across the rough walls of the village inn, aptly named the Sleepy Mare. A bard, dressed in bright patchwork robes that looked suspiciously like your grandmother's quilt, strummed a battered lute, drawing the crowd closer. Your eyes widened in wonder as tales of heroes, quests, and distant kingdoms filled your ears and imagination. These were no ordinary bedtime stories. The bards spoke of Sir Godfrey, who fought valiantly against impossible odds, armed only with courage and an absurdly shiny sword. You chuckled softly when the bard dramatically described the knight's gleaming armor, likely impossible in a mud-filled medieval reality. Historically, armor maintenance was a constant struggle, more rust and grime than glamour. But Who were you to question artistic license? One evening, the bard spun a particularly captivating yarn about dragons. Yes, dragons. Medieval people genuinely believed in such creatures, not as fairy tale monsters, but actual threats. Knights claimed dragon sightings. Villages whispered about dragon caves hidden deep within the forest. Historians still debate whether these sightings were misidentified large reptiles or merely imaginative exaggerations born of fear. But for you, the idea of facing a dragon became a thrilling, if slightly terrifying, goal. After all, a knight was supposed to conquer fears, right? You vividly imagined your eventual heroics, standing tall against scales and fire, probably wishing for a bucket of water and a sturdy shield. The bard noticed your intent attention, grinned knowingly, and wove a tale seemingly aimed right at your heart. He described the rigorous path of knighthood, the endless training, demanding loyalty, and a bizarre requirement to prove oneself in battle, often without actually being a knight yet. It sounded impossibly daunting, but oh so compelling. You leaned closer, committing every detail to memory. The bard's final words lingered dramatically. Every night begins as nothing more than a dreamer in front of a fireplace, but only a rare few will trade warmth for steel, dreams for reality. That night, lying in bed beneath your scratchy wool blanket, you considered those words carefully. Trading dreams for reality meant leaving Eldergrove, stepping beyond the familiar comfort of home into an uncertain world. It meant facing not just dragons, imagined or real, but also the scrutiny of others, relentless training, and occasionally embarrassing customs. Imagine eating peacock roasted in its feathers. Delicacy or absurdity? You smiled at the thought. If there was anything you'd learned from the bard, it was that heroism often wore a mask of humor and absurdity, and courage often appeared when least expected. Tomorrow, you'd take your first real step toward knighthood. Tonight, though, you let your imagination soar freely, already tasting adventure on your tongue, rich and tantalizing as the honey cakes the village baker made every festival. Your destiny called, and you were ready, at least in theory, to answer.
Morning broke colder than you'd hoped, your breath visible in wispy clouds as you stood nervously at the gates of Eldergrove, clutching a makeshift sack filled with modest possessions, a wool tunic, hard bread wrapped tightly, and a carved wooden figure your father crafted, shaped, unsurprisingly, like a knight. Soon enough, you found yourself in the bustling courtyard of Lord Irwin's manor. Here your dream collided abruptly with reality, trading romantic notions of immediate glory for the sobering introduction to life as a page. Historically, becoming a knight required progressing through strict ranks, page, then squire, and only after years of training, knighthood itself. It wasn't quick, and it certainly wasn't easy. Your new existence was dominated not by sword fights and glorious quests, but by simple repetitive chores, fetching water, cleaning armor, so much armor, and running messages. The sensory details were relentless. The heavy scent of beeswax polish mixed with sweat, the constant creaking of leather straps, and the chill of early mornings that made your bones ache. If your knuckles weren't raw from scrubbing rust, your feet were sore from running errands. One particularly dreary task involved polishing silver goblets until they gleamed. Knights valued appearances at court, even if actual table manners left much to be desired.
Did you know medieval nobles often tossed their bones straight onto the floor during feasts? Perhaps cleanliness wasn't next to godliness after all. Still, you approached these tasks with youthful enthusiasm, believing every scrub and errand somehow brought you closer to heroics. Besides, these chores gave you ample time to observe knights closely, secretly mimicking their stances and speeches whenever possible, often humorously failing. Your efforts at emulation drew laughter from the kitchen staff more than once. Despite the endless drudgery, small moments reminded you why you embarked on this path. Once, while delivering a message, you glimpsed Lord Irwin sparring in full armor. Watching the fluidity of motion, the powerful strikes, and hearing the sharp clang of steel on steel was mesmerizing. You practically floated through chores afterward, inspired anew by witnessing what lay ahead. Interestingly, medieval pages were also expected to learn etiquette, dance, and even basic poetry. A knight wasn't just a fighter, but also a cultured individual. This expectation was rather amusing considering the everyday roughness of their manners, something historians still debate. Was this contradiction a genuine reflection of knightly life or merely idealized storytelling? Either way, you found yourself stumbling through awkward dance lessons, your feet tangled more often than gracefully stepping, drawing both laughter and sympathetic sighs from your instructor. Poetry fared little better, your attempts at rhyme more comic than romantic, often comparing battle courage awkwardly to farm animals or kitchen utensils. Yet despite these setbacks, every misstep only solidified your determination. Each scrub, fetch, and stumble was simply another small step toward becoming a knight. And besides, at least you hadn't mistaken the armor polish for stew again, although admittedly, you were close. The path ahead promised more challenges and comedic trials, but also undeniably growth. And every night, exhausted but hopeful, you dreamed again of armor, honor, and finally, holding your own shining sword.
Your first day in armor wasn't nearly as glamorous as you had envisioned, far from it actually. You stood stiffly in the middle of the training ground, trying not to topple over beneath the overwhelming weight of metal plates. Armor, you quickly realized, wasn't designed for comfort. The heavy, cumbersome pieces made even simple movements like turning your head or waving your hand ridiculously difficult. The other pages and squires chuckled openly, remembering their own clumsy beginnings. Your instructor, Sir Baldwin, a grizzled old knight with a surprisingly gentle heart beneath his stern exterior, gave you an amused yet understanding glance. "Everyone starts like a newborn calf," he called out, a rare smile tugging his gruff beard. You flushed with embarrassment, but managed a shaky grin in return. Armor in medieval times wasn't a simple suit. Each component, helmet, cuirass, gauntlets, greaves, was meticulously crafted, intended to protect, but not necessarily to provide agility. Knights often required squires to assist them into their armor, a process humorously complicated enough to demand step-by-step instructions. You fumbled endlessly with straps, buckles, and ties, more than once nearly fastening a piece upside down. Historical fact: in medieval armor, often weighed up to 60 pounds, roughly the equivalent of carrying a medium-sized dog everywhere you went. And speaking of dogs, historians still argue whether medieval knights wore full armor regularly or reserved it solely for tournaments and battles. Given your aching shoulders, you sincerely hoped the latter was true. Walking felt like dragging through thick mud. Running, well, that was out of the question entirely. Your first attempt sent you crashing spectacularly into a bale of hay, helmet spinning off dramatically. Peals of laughter echoed across the courtyard, even from stern-faced knights. You groaned inwardly, realizing heroism felt impossibly distant. Armor's discomfort didn't end with weight alone. Vision was drastically limited through tiny helmet slits, making peripheral sight almost non-existent. Breathing was hot, damp, and echoed uncomfortably inside the metal confines. Yet through all these troubles, you began to appreciate the resilience knights had to build over time. To make matters amusingly worse, nature called at the most inconvenient moments. Historically, knights had limited solutions for such situations, usually requiring assistance to remove armor quickly or resorting to rather awkward solutions. You learned to plan your hydration carefully to avoid future embarrassments. Gradually, however, awkwardness gave way to determination. Every stumble taught you balance. Every miscalculation improved your precision. Day by day, you adapted, slowly gaining control, learning to trust the rigid protection that initially seemed your adversary. Your most triumphant moment came unexpectedly during a basic maneuver drill. You successfully turned without tripping, and cheers erupted from the sidelines, mostly sarcastic but affectionate. You grinned broadly beneath your stifling helmet, pride swelling warmly within your chest. By day's end, muscles screaming for mercy and armor gleaming more from sweat than polish, you realized you'd survived your first genuine challenge. The journey of a knight, after all, was defined not just by victories, but by these humble, laughably clumsy beginnings. And hey, at least you'd avoided falling face first into the manure pile. Today, anyway.
Next came your training in horsemanship, an indispensable skill for any aspiring knight. Horses weren't simply pets or transportation, they were crucial partners in battle, tournaments, and everyday life. And as you soon discovered, horses had their own opinions about your supposed partnership. You met your assigned mount on a crisp, misty morning, an enormous chestnut mare named Hazel, whose disdainful snort made her feelings about novices quite clear. You approached cautiously, holding out your hand, palm open, hoping for acceptance or at least truce. Instead, she turned away, uninterested. You sighed. Apparently, this partnership would take some convincing. Your riding instructor, Sir Gareth, a lanky knight with an ironic fear of chickens, much to everyone's amusement, chuckled at your plight. "Don't worry," he assured, eyes twinkling. "Horses are like noble ladies. They take time to court properly." You doubted noble ladies bit fingers when offered apples, but you held your tongue. Learning to saddle and bridle a horse was your first task, which proved frustratingly complicated. Historically, medieval tack was far more cumbersome than modern gear, heavy and adorned with elaborate designs, often emphasizing status over practicality. You fumbled with buckles and straps repeatedly, Hazel watching with bored patience, occasionally stamping a hoof to emphasize your slowness. Finally, saddled, you climbed awkwardly atop Hazel's back, only to immediately slip sideways, hanging precariously by your fingertips. Historical tidbit: medieval saddles were built high-backed to help knights stay mounted during combat, but clearly they did little for balance-challenged beginners like yourself. Once actually riding, every step felt precarious. You wobbled atop Hazel like a leaf on the wind, gripping reins and saddle desperately. Trotting was an entirely new torture, bouncing uncontrollably, every bone rattling. Hazel seemed amused, deliberately choosing uneven paths, splashing through muddy puddles or stopping abruptly to nibble grass, sending you nearly flying over her head. Interestingly, historians still debate whether medieval knights preferred powerful destriers, massive war horses, or more manageable coursers and rounceys for everyday riding. Hazel was definitely the powerful sort, confident, opinionated, and strong enough to carry a fully armored knight, but frustratingly resistant to a novice rider's commands. Yet with every fall, inevitable and frequent, you learned something essential: patience and humility. Knights needed trust and cooperation from their mounts, relationships formed through mutual respect and understanding rather than dominance alone. Slowly, your interactions with Hazel shifted. You began to anticipate her movements, learning subtle cues, the flick of an ear, tension in her muscles, even the particular snort signaling displeasure. Your instructor noted your improving connection with Hazel, offering rare praise. One afternoon, in a moment of quiet companionship, Hazel gently nuzzled your shoulder. You grinned widely, feeling accepted at last. Sure, horsemanship wasn't as instantly heroic as wielding swords or wearing armor, but it was fundamental, every bit as challenging, rewarding, and humorously humbling. You quickly realized the partnership between knight and steed wasn't just historical romanticism, but a deep, practical bond. As you unsaddled Hazel later that day, your confidence bolstered. You silently thanked your stubborn yet magnificent partner. Knighthood, it seemed, was just as much about managing horse personalities as it was about heroism. And luckily for you, Hazel was proving an unforgettable, if somewhat mischievous, teacher.
Your introduction to sword training was perhaps even more awkward than your first attempts at riding. After all, a knight without swordsmanship was about as useful as a baker without flour, though you quickly realized flour rarely caused accidental bruises. Your instructor for swordplay, Sir Adric, was a stern-faced knight famous for his uncompromising discipline, and equally legendary for a mustache so grand it surely required its own armor. He handed you your first practice sword, made of wood but surprisingly heavy and unbalanced. You gripped it awkwardly, wondering how knights made wielding swords look so effortless in the tales. "It's about balance and precision," Sir Adric intoned, his voice deep and gravelly. You nodded earnestly, then promptly swung too enthusiastically, nearly toppling yourself over. Suppressed laughter rippled through the gathered squires. You blushed deeply, silently resolving to improve quickly. Historically, training with wooden swords, called wasters, was standard practice for pages and squires, designed to minimize injuries, though not embarrassment, apparently. Your initial exercises involved basic stances and repetitive swings meant to build muscle memory and endurance. The monotony was exhausting, and your arms burned relentlessly from lifting and swinging. Amid these repetitive drills, Sir Adric shared curious medieval beliefs, like the idea that swords carried symbolic and almost mystical significance, representing justice and authority as much as combat prowess. You eyed your battered wooden stick skeptically, wondering if symbolism made bruises hurt any less. Yet gradually, frustration began yielding progress. Your swings became steadier, footwork less clumsy. Sir Adric introduced you to the ward positions, knights adopted to defend and attack effectively. Learning the difference between high guard and low guard was like memorizing dance steps, except the stakes were slightly higher, literally involving sticks swinging near your face. Occasionally, you paired up to practice with fellow trainees, resulting in awkward clashes and accidental hits. A particularly memorable incident occurred when your wooden blade slipped and flew out of your hands, landing spectacularly in a nearby bush. Historians debate whether medieval sword fights were graceful ballets or clumsy, chaotic scrambles. Judging from your early attempts, you leaned firmly toward the latter. Still, there were moments of clarity and confidence, fleeting yet powerful. You began noticing patterns, predicting opponents' moves, and reacting appropriately. Sir Adric nodded approvingly after you executed a proper parry and counterattack, and the rare praise made your battered spirits soar. Swordplay, you discovered, required mental sharpness as much as physical strength. Knights had to anticipate opponents' actions, strategize under pressure, and adapt swiftly. Skills far removed from the brute force stereotype. Even your wooden sword, initially cumbersome and awkward, started feeling like an extension of yourself. As your skill slowly improved,
The mock battles became exhilarating rather than merely embarrassing. Your initial nervousness transformed into excitement and determination, each clash of wood echoing the dreams ignited by the fireside bard. By evening, exhausted but buoyant, you found yourself gazing at the wooden blade thoughtfully. Swordplay, while challenging, was also thrilling, a dance of strategy, strength, and skill. Perhaps your journey toward knighthood was shaping up after all, even if your sword was for now only made of splintering oak.
Amid swordplay and horsemanship, your training inevitably involved navigating another essential knightly skill: social dynamics. Medieval courts were notoriously complex, and even among pages and squires, hierarchies quickly formed, some based on skill, others purely on charisma or family connections. You soon realized that mastering etiquette and diplomacy was nearly as crucial as wielding a sword, and infinitely trickier. Your peers were a mixed group, each bringing their unique quirks. Thomas, an affable squire with perpetually messy hair and an endless appetite, quickly became your closest ally. Conversely, Edmund, a page from minor nobility, became your unexpected rival. Edmund possessed a sharp tongue, quick wit, and the annoying habit of excelling effortlessly at almost everything. Naturally, this made your own missteps particularly frustrating. A notable incident involved a friendly sparring session with Sir Baldwin. While historically knights were taught to temper competitiveness with chivalry, rivalries often flared regardless. Edmund confidently blocked your strikes, casually throwing witty remarks about your technique. Each comment chipped away at your composure until inevitably your frustration boiled over. You lunged impulsively, slipping awkwardly, landing in the mud. Laughter erupted around you, cheeks blazing with embarrassment as Edmund offered a mock bow, smiling smugly. Yet amidst the humiliation, you heard Thomas's reassuring voice from the sidelines. "Don't worry, Kyle. Even the greatest knights tasted plenty of dirt." Strangely, such incidents reinforced valuable lessons in humility and resilience. Medieval training wasn't solely about physical prowess. It also molded character, emphasizing patience, humility, and grace, even amid setbacks. Historians continue debating whether medieval knightly ideals genuinely shaped personal character or merely idealized behaviors rarely practiced. In your experience, though, they felt poignantly real. You learned quickly to read social cues, identifying allies and rivals, noting when to engage and when diplomacy served best. A particularly amusing diplomatic lesson occurred during a training feast. Seating arrangements, meticulously organized by rank, led to endless confusion among new pages. Accidentally sitting in a spot above your station could cause a scandal rivaling royal intrigue. Naturally, you blundered directly into such a scandal, unknowingly claiming Edmund's seat. The icy silence that descended was deafening. The amused whispers mortifying. Fortunately, Thomas intervened smoothly, diffusing tension by humorously suggesting Edmund might actually enjoy dining closer to the kitchen. Fewer steps for seconds. The room burst into laughter, the tension evaporating instantly. You moved sheepishly to the correct seat, secretly grateful for Thomas's quick wit. That night, you learned a vital lesson about medieval social life. Friendships and alliances were crucial. Skill in battle mattered, but navigating the tricky corridors of courtly life, sometimes literally, held equal importance. These social interactions, though frustrating, also brought levity and camaraderie to your rigorous routine. You and Thomas often joked about medieval customs, especially the more absurd ones,
like the belief that carrying dried herbs prevented disease, a superstition that led knights to stuff their armor uncomfortably full of pungent leaves. Through these everyday mishaps and triumphs, your confidence gradually grew. Rivalries like Edmund's challenged you. Friendships like Thomas's supported you. And each encounter, good or bad, deepened your understanding of what it genuinely cost to pursue knighthood. It wasn't just physical hardship, it was also learning to maneuver gracefully through the intricate, sometimes baffling world of medieval society.
One crisp morning brought a different kind of challenge, one far subtler than swordplay or etiquette, yet equally daunting. Sir Baldwin tethered all squires and pages in the great hall to lecture on chivalry, the legendary knightly code of honor. This wasn't about physical skill, but moral strength, and judging by the serious faces around you, no one considered it trivial. Honor isn't just about winning, Sir Baldwin's voice echoed solemnly through the hall, but about how one behaves in the pursuit of victory. He paused dramatically, his gaze sweeping over everyone present. You felt inexplicably guilty under his scrutiny, despite having done nothing wrong. Yet, historically, the chivalric code included ideals like bravery, honesty, loyalty, and protection of the weak. Noble, undoubtedly, but challenging in daily life where situations rarely were black and white. You soon learned this firsthand, as Sir Baldwin posed hypothetical scenarios, each trickier than the last, often with no clear answer. Your scenario was particularly thorny. Suppose you caught your closest friend cheating during a tournament. Reporting it would uphold honor but betray friendship. Ignoring it preserved loyalty but compromised fairness. You stumbled through an awkward answer, acutely aware of Edmund's smirking from the sidelines. This kind of ethical puzzle was far tougher than swinging a wooden sword. Historians still debate how strictly medieval knights adhered to chivalric codes. Some argue it was more literary idealism than practical reality, often overshadowed by personal ambition and political complexities. Listening to Sir Baldwin, you wondered if knights truly agonized over such decisions, or if reality simplified matters through necessity. Your thoughts were interrupted by another scenario. A noble knight faced with saving a village or a single influential noble. Most favored saving the village. After all, chivalry emphasized protecting the weak. Edmund, unsurprisingly, argued the noble's strategic importance mattered more. You found yourself grudgingly understanding his perspective, feeling uncomfortable that Edmund's viewpoint, irritatingly, made logical sense. These discussions extended beyond mere classroom debates. Later, tending horses in the stable, Thomas pondered aloud. Do you think knights actually lived up to these ideals, Cale, or was it all show? You shrugged, running a brush through Hazel's mane thoughtfully. Maybe it was both. Idealism mixed with practicality. Hazel snorted softly, as if expressing skepticism about the entire discussion. Amid these ethical explorations, you experienced firsthand the humorous contradictions of chivalry in practice. A senior knight, Sir Gerard, renowned for championing justice, once loudly accused a kitchen servant of theft, only to sheepishly discover he'd simply misplaced his own coin curse. Such incidents underscored chivalry's complexity. High ideals often collided comically or tragically with messy reality. Nevertheless, these lessons left a profound impact, prompting reflection on your own values. Honoring chivalric ideals wasn't straightforward, demanding constant evaluation and humility. Each ethical challenge sharpened your moral compass, shaping you into someone capable of navigating complex situations beyond physical battles. By evening, you felt mentally drained, yet oddly satisfied. Knighthood wasn't just about mastering combat, but also confronting difficult choices and recognizing imperfections. You might never perfectly embody chivalry, but striving toward these ideals was itself deeply rewarding. Plus, it provided endless opportunities for humorous reflection. After all, who could perfectly balance honor, friendship, and avoiding embarrassment at the dinner table?
Finally, the day arrived, your first official tournament, the medieval equivalent of a proving ground. You'd trained tirelessly for weeks, imagining moments of glory in vivid detail. Of course, reality, as always, had its own humorous twist waiting in the wings. Tournament days were spectacles, bustling with activity. The air buzzed with excitement and smelled heavily of horses, straw, and roasting meat from merchant stalls. Bright pennants fluttered cheerfully against the blue sky, though the pleasant scenery belied the chaos unfolding below. Knights clattered around awkwardly, squires scurried frantically, and horses neighed irritably, clearly unhappy with the noise and confusion. Your armor gleamed, meticulously polished, a rare achievement given your usual struggles with maintenance. Thomas had cheerfully insisted on assisting, resulting in only minor mishaps, like accidentally dropping your helmet in a bucket of oats. Edmund strutted confidently nearby, smirking, armor impeccably maintained, effortlessly radiating arrogance. Sir Baldwin outlined your role, mostly supporting squires, fetching equipment, holding horses, and watching carefully. Realistically, pages rarely jousted themselves, and squires sparred under controlled conditions. Still, your heart raced at the mere possibility of participating. The first rounds involved jousting, the iconic medieval sport where knights charged toward each other with lances, aiming to unseat their opponents. Historically, jousting wasn't just entertainment. It was a martial practice mimicking real battle conditions. Of course, historians still debate whether tournaments more realistically prepared knights for war or simply entertained bored nobles. Watching, you marveled at the sheer intensity. Lance shattered dramatically against armor. Riders tumbled gracelessly from saddles. Crowds gasped and cheered wildly. The sheer spectacle both thrilled and terrified you. Thankfully, your tasks remained safely mundane, until Thomas, grinning mischievously, whispered, "Ready for a bit of excitement?" Before you could protest, he thrust a banner into your hands, directing you toward the tournament field. Your heart pounded furiously as you awkwardly hurried onto the field, nearly tripping in front of the gathered audience. Holding the banner straight proved surprisingly challenging, wind tugging it stubbornly, threatening your already precarious balance. Predictably, disaster struck quickly. A passing horse, startled by the fluttering banner, reared unexpectedly, causing its knight to lurch sideways, landing comically, yet safely, in the dirt. Your cheeks burned with embarrassment as laughter echoed, though mercifully mixed with cheers. Even Edmund struggled to suppress his amused smirk. Yet, amidst humiliation, came a valuable lesson about tournaments. They tested not only skills, but composure under pressure. Knights needed calm nerves, quick reflexes, and ability to handle unexpected chaos gracefully. Clearly, you still had plenty to learn. Afterwards, sitting exhausted yet relieved beside Thomas, you laughed sheepishly, reflecting on the day's mishaps. "Think they'll ever let me hold a banner again?" you joked. Thomas chuckled warmly. "Maybe just a very small one," he teased. Your first tournament ended without glory, but with vital lessons and plenty of laughter. Despite embarrassment, your determination grew stronger. Each failure taught humility. Each small triumph fueled ambition. Tomorrow promised fresh challenges, new embarrassments, but also renewed hope. For now, though, you savored the camaraderie, laughter, and the reassuringly human imperfections of your knightly journey. And thankfully, no actual jousting had occurred, at least not yet.
The aftermath of your first tournament wasn't merely about bruised pride and laughter. It opened your eyes to a deeper truth about medieval society, its stark contrasts, and ambiguous morality. Knights, lords, and peasants occupied distinct yet interconnected worlds, often blending ideals of chivalry with pragmatic realities. Your duties occasionally brought you into close contact with serfs and servants, people who were essential yet overlooked cogs in the medieval machine. One evening, while fetching supplies, you met Elias, a gentle, elderly stable hand known for his uncanny ability to soothe even the most skittish horses. Chatting quietly while brushing Hazel, Elias casually revealed fascinating insights about daily peasant life. You learned, for instance, that serfs were legally bound to land owned by nobles, their lives largely dictated by obligations rather than personal choice. Elias spoke without bitterness, yet the quiet resignation in his eyes haunted you. Knighthood seemed glorious, yet your training had shielded you somewhat from harsher realities of medieval existence. Historical fact, the majority of medieval populations were peasants, their lives centered around agriculture, heavily influenced by seasonal cycles and feudal duties. Their stories were rarely heroic, but profoundly important. Your awareness deepened when Edmund casually dismissed Elias one afternoon, rudely demanding immediate saddle repairs despite the old man's obvious exhaustion. You bit your tongue, recalling chivalric teachings about protecting the weak, yet uncertain how to react practically. Such contradictions troubled you deeply. Where was honor when it truly mattered? Historians continued debating medieval knights' genuine commitment to protecting lower classes. Was chivalry a practical moral code, genuinely shaping behavior, or merely an idealized mask conveniently removed when inconvenient? Observing Edmund's behavior, you felt this ambiguity acutely. Thomas shared your discomfort, quietly discussing these moral dilemmas during late-night conversations. "It's easy to speak about honor," he sighed one evening, "much harder to live it consistently." To your surprise, even Sir Baldwin indirectly acknowledged such complexities, reminding trainees that true knighthood wasn't mere rank or privilege, but genuine moral responsibility. Strength is easy to wield, he emphasized solemnly, but using strength justly, especially when difficult, that defines character. An incident soon tested this wisdom practically. A local lord, notoriously harsh towards serfs, requested knights' aid in quelling minor unrest. The ethical tension was palpable, following orders versus ethical reservations. Sir Baldwin navigated carefully, subtly protecting peasants while appeasing the lord. You observed keenly, realizing knightly power came not just from combat, but also clever diplomacy and careful moral judgment. Amid such heavy revelations, humor sometimes provided relief. Elias once joked dryly about a curious medieval belief. Planting crops by moonlight supposedly guaranteed bountiful harvests, a superstition many serfs religiously observed. "At least moonlight gardening keeps things lively," he chuckled wryly, earning your grateful laughter. This period profoundly reshaped your understanding of knighthood. The medieval world wasn't neatly heroic, nor straightforwardly honorable, but deeply nuanced. True knighthood meant grappling continually with complex choices, seeking honor amid ambiguity, and sometimes questioning the very structures upholding your ideals. As you drifted off that night, Elias's quiet dignity, Edmund's arrogance, Thomas's thoughtful reflections, and Sir Baldwin's cautious diplomacy filled your thoughts. Your path toward knighthood wasn't just about training muscles or memorizing codes. It was about navigating moral gray areas and discovering true honor, one careful step at a time.
Physical realities of knightly training quickly became undeniable, leaving your body frequently sore, bruised, and humorously battered. Each morning you awoke aching in muscles you never knew existed, evidence of your relentless pursuit toward knighthood. One particularly grueling day began with an obstacle course designed by Sir Gareth, intended, he cheerfully explained, to mimic battlefield conditions. The challenges included crawling beneath obstacles, scaling slippery walls, and maneuvering through mud-filled trenches. Naturally, Edmund completed each obstacle with irritating ease, flashing smug smiles your direction. When your turn arrived, initial confidence quickly dissolved into awkward reality. You slipped clumsily over walls, tangled comically in netting, and frequently found yourself sprawled in cold mud. By the end, your face, hands, and clothing resembled something closer to a bog monster than a knight in training. Historically, medieval knights regularly faced brutal physical demands. Armor weighed heavily, horses required considerable strength and control, and battlefields presented exhausting conditions. Physical endurance was as crucial as skill in swordplay or horsemanship, and knights trained vigorously to withstand these conditions. Sir Gareth humorously reminded trainees of medieval customs aimed at toughening bodies, such as deliberately bathing in cold water, believed to strengthen constitution and prevent illness. You shivered, half convinced medieval people might have been slightly masochistic or simply indifferent to comfort. Yet despite frequent mishaps and bruises, small victories slowly emerged. You began handling armor more confidently, enduring obstacle courses without complete disaster, and recovering faster from exhausting drills. Every ache and bruise, you realized, marked progress rather than failure. Historians debate whether medieval knights genuinely appreciated the grueling training or merely endured it out of necessity. Your experiences suggested a mixture of both. Begrudging acknowledgement of necessity mingled with genuine pride at increasing strength and resilience. In one memorable instance, your bruised determination was humorously rewarded. Sir Gareth announced a mock battle exercise, a melee, where trainees would practice group combat tactics. Initially dreading further humiliation, you surprised yourself by holding your ground effectively, successfully deflecting attacks and cooperating with peers, even saving Thomas from a particularly aggressive opponent, not Edmund, thankfully. The bruises afterward felt different, earned through genuine accomplishment, physical proof of your growing abilities. Thomas grinned warmly, clapping your shoulder, jokingly remarking that soon you'd bear enough battle scars to impress any noble lady. These physical hardships often offered moments of humor and camaraderie, forming bonds of friendship and mutual respect among trainees. Even Edmund begrudgingly acknowledged your improvement, albeit with backhanded compliments disguised as insults. One evening, reflecting on your bruises and blisters, Elias chuckled sympathetically, offering a curious medieval remedy, a paste of honey, vinegar, and herbs intended to soothe aches. You skeptically accepted, humorously wondering if you'd end up smelling like a kitchen pantry. Yet, as bizarre as medieval remedies seemed, they represented a deeper truth. Knighthood required not only skill, but also resilience, physical and mental. Every bruise, blister, and awkward misstep became part of your story, a necessary cost toward achieving your dream. Lying sore but content in bed that night, muscles protesting every movement, you realized you'd grown stronger, not just physically, but in spirit. And while you doubted medieval vinegar honey paste truly worked wonders, the comforting gesture underscored a profound truth. True knighthood was forged through perseverance, laughter, and countless bruises.
The morning sun was barely above the horizon when your training took a startling turn toward realism, a simulated siege exercise. Knights often faced sieges during medieval warfare, whether defending castles or laying siege to enemy fortifications. Today, the training ground transformed into a small fort, complete with wooden palisades, hay bales simulating walls, and trainees divided into attackers and defenders. You found yourself on the attacking side, nervously gripping a wooden sword and shield. Thomas stood beside you, his normally jovial expression uncharacteristically serious. Edmund, naturally, led the defenders, smugly confident atop his makeshift rampart. Sir Baldwin explained the rules succinctly. Attackers must breach defenses and capture the flag inside the fort. Defenders must repel attackers for as long as possible. Despite wooden weapons and hay walls, tension crackled palpably. Siege warfare was grueling, historically marked by slow, exhausting battles involving battering rams, siege towers, and catapults launching projectiles, sometimes flaming. Thankfully, today's battle excluded fire, but realism remained intense. At Sir Baldwin's signal, your team surged forward, initially chaotically. You clumsily scrambled over wooden barricades, stumbling awkwardly under enemy fire, soft leather balls, thankfully, rather than rocks or arrows. Each strike stung pride more than body, though occasional bruises were inevitable. Approaching the main gate, your group struggled hilariously with a makeshift battering ram, a large log requiring coordinated teamwork. Coordination, unfortunately, proved elusive. The ram swung haphazardly, occasionally knocking into allies instead of gates, evoking laughter mixed with frustrated groans. Edmund, predictably, seized every opportunity to mock your efforts. "Are you attacking us or each other?" he called mockingly from above, eliciting irritated yet amused responses. Despite struggles, you gradually learned valuable lessons about siege warfare's gritty realities. Historically, attackers faced harsh conditions, limited food, exposure to weather, risk of disease, all compounded by physical and psychological strain. Your mock siege provided only a taste, yet vividly underscored historical realities. Historians continue debating whether medieval sieges were truly effective military strategies or simply desperate measures reflecting warfare's brutality. Participating firsthand, even humorously, you grasped how physically and mentally demanding such battles were. Eventually, through sheer persistence, your team managed to breach the gate. You rushed forward, heart pounding, amidst cheers and jeers from both sides. In the chaotic melee, you found yourself face to face with Edmund. Grinning confidently, he lunged aggressively, forcing your quick, instinctive parry. Your training crystallized into sudden clarity, actions becoming reflexive, movements fluid rather than awkward. Edmund's smug smile faltered slightly, your defense surprisingly solid. Thomas, seeing your determined stand, rallied allies around you, pushing defenders back. Amid cheers, laughter, and swirling dust, your team seized the flag victoriously. Later, sprawled breathlessly yet triumphantly beside Thomas, you laughed, recounting humorous mishaps, the rogue battering ram, accidental friendly hits, Edmund's shocked expression when you successfully parried. "Maybe there's hope for us yet," Thomas chuckled warmly, nudging you affectionately. Today's exercise reinforced an essential truth. Knighthood wasn't just romantic quests or tournaments, but gritty realism, demanding physical endurance, strategic thinking, and teamwork. The simulated siege had been chaotic, exhausting, sometimes comical, yet profoundly instructive. As twilight painted skies richly, muscles aching yet spirits soaring, you reflected thoughtfully. Sieges might be historically brutal, often debated, occasionally absurd, but today they'd strengthened your resolve, sharpened your skills, and deepened friendships. And perhaps, most importantly, shown Edmund you weren't entirely hopeless after all.
As if siege drills and bruised pride weren't enough, the next phase of your training tackled something arguably more perilous than melee combat: courtly manners. That's right, etiquette. It turns out surviving a battlefield was easier than navigating a formal banquet without scandalizing a noble.
Courtly etiquette was a cornerstone of knighthood. A true knight needed to dine, speak, and move with grace, ideally without tripping over his own feet or offending a baroness by using the wrong spoon. And so you found yourself in the grand dining hall, standing awkwardly beside Thomas and Edmund, trying to recall which side the napkin went on. Did medieval people even have napkins? Lady Celestine, an impossibly elegant noblewoman with a gaze that could curdle milk, oversaw etiquette instruction. Her lessons were delivered with the calm intensity of a falcon eyeing a nervous squirrel. She demonstrated correct posture, speech, and dining customs, expecting nothing short of perfection. "Bow from the waist, not the neck," she scolded, as you hastily tried to recover from an overly enthusiastic nod that nearly dislodged your belt. Thomas stifled laughter behind his goblet. Historically, courtly etiquette served as a social lubricant among nobility, helping distinguish refined knights from common brutes. Knights were expected to show deference, choose their words carefully, and eat without appearing ravenous, despite often being ravenous. One particularly memorable faux pas came when you mistook a delicate sauce bowl for soup and took an eager gulp. The silence that followed was deafening. Edmund raised an eyebrow, and Lady Celestine's expression tightened. "That," she said icily, "was for dipping. You wished the stone floor would open up and swallow you." Still, through blunders came growth. You learned to address nobles with the right titles, to pause dramatically before speaking, even if only to remember what not to say, and to eat slowly, even if it meant cold stew. These skills were less flashy than swordplay, yet crucial. A knight might win battles, but social grace won allies, and invitations to feasts where better food was served. One odd fact you learned along the way: medieval belief held that certain foods affected temperament. Red wine was said to invigorate the blood, while lettuce cooled the passions, hence why knights were encouraged to eat wisely before court appearances. You couldn't help but wonder if your recent lettuce-heavy lunch explained your uncharacteristic calm during a recitation of proper toasting protocol. Historians still argue whether medieval manners were genuinely practiced outside noble courts or largely aspirational ideals portrayed in chivalric texts. Judging by the expressions of sheer confusion around the dining table, you suspected many pages were just as lost as you. By the end of your etiquette training, you'd earned Lady Celestine's grudging approval. "You are passable," she said with the faintest incline of her head. A compliment by her standards. Thomas clapped you on the back. "You didn't spill anything or insult anyone. That's practically a miracle." You grinned, confidence rising, not because you'd mastered courtly life, but because you'd survived it, awkward elbows and all. Another step toward knighthood, even if you still weren't entirely sure about the napkin.
Not long after your near defeat at the hands of a sauce bowl, your training took a turn toward the mysterious. One drizzly afternoon, you were summoned to assist the castle's resident almoner, a position typically responsible for distributing alms, but in this case, the man also dabbled in the arcane arts. Enter Brother Anselm, a wiry man with perpetually ink-stained fingers and a suspicious fondness for dried frog legs. Brother Anselm wasn't a wizard, at least not officially, but he collected herbs, read omens, and maintained a library full of curious tomes with titles like Celestial Alignments and the Humors of Cattle. You were tasked with helping organize these scrolls, but the real education came from his endless lectures on medieval magical beliefs, most of which you found both fascinating and just a little bit absurd. He explained, for instance, that many knights once carried talismans to protect against arrows, often made from boar teeth or tiny cloth bundles filled with ash. Some swore by unicorn horns, which were, historians later confirmed, actually narwhal tusks sold by enterprising traders.
According to Anselm, garlic worn around the neck kept away not just sickness, but also fairies. You made a mental note to never test that one at court. Still, medieval people didn't distinguish magic from science the way we do today. Astrology, herbalism, and religious ritual were all woven together. You listened intently, wondering how much of this belief shaped real knightly behavior. There were moments you swore Anselm enjoyed watching your skepticism bend. "Laugh all you like," he once said, while sprinkling salt on the threshold to ward off evil spirits, but the knight who forgets to honor the unseen often ends up quite seen. You chose not to ask what that meant. Too cryptic, too spooky. Interestingly, historians still argue whether knights genuinely believed in these magical protections or merely humored them for morale's sake. You imagined both were true, especially when staring down enemies or engaging in duels with higher stakes than ego. Brother Anselm also taught you the importance of symbols, charms etched into armor, strange blessings whispered over blades. Knights, it seemed, were as superstitious as they were brave. Even Sir Baldwin, not one for nonsense, touched a small token around his neck before every battle. A gift from his wife, he said, but maybe, you thought, a quiet prayer too. One particularly odd ritual involved bathing your sword in moonlight before combat for clarity and righteous aim. You tried it once, half in jest, laying your wooden sword across a windowsill. The next day, you blocked one of Edmund's strikes effortlessly. Coincidence? Probably, but you never skipped the moonlight soak again. These fringe beliefs added layers to your understanding of knighthood. It wasn't just strength or etiquette, it was about hope, rituals, and sometimes grasping for a sense of control in an unpredictable world, even if it meant tolerating the smell of frog legs and burnt sage. And as you left Brother Anselm's candlelit study that evening, the scent of herbs clinging to your tunic, you felt oddly grounded. Maybe not magically protected, but connected to the stories, the traditions, and the quiet mysteries that made medieval life feel as enchanted as it was real.
The morning came quietly, shrouded in fog and the kind of silence that made even birds pause. You stood at the edge of the training yard, heart beating a little faster than usual. Today, it wasn't just another round of sword drills or etiquette disasters. Today, you were to take the squire's oath. This moment marked a shift in your journey. Pages dreamed, squires trained in earnest, and the line between the two was drawn with solemn words and the weight of expectation. Sir Baldwin stood beside you, dressed not in battle gear, but in a dark cloak trimmed with humble gold. He looked at you as one might look at a seedling about to sprout or flop over dramatically. You hoped for the first. The ceremony was simple, not the elaborate feast you might have imagined during bard-filled nights in Eldergrove. Instead, a few knights gathered, quiet and respectful. A short prayer was said. A sword was placed before you. Not handed over, not yet. You knelt beside it, reciting the oath from memory, every word dry in your mouth but burning in your chest. I vow to serve with honor, courage, and humility, to protect the weak, to act justly, and to uphold the code of knighthood until my strength fails or my life ends. Each syllable felt heavier than the last. It wasn't theatrical, it was personal, and a bit terrifying. Historically, becoming a squire signified that a youth had proven himself through service and learning. It meant not just that you were old enough, but that others believed you might one day be worthy of knighthood. Still, historians debate how consistently these oaths were honored, and whether the chivalric ideals reflected real behaviors or just convenient aspirations sewn into tradition. You weren't sure. All you knew was that when Sir Baldwin placed his hand on your shoulder and gave a quiet, "Rise, Squire Cale," something shifted deep inside. Of course, any illusion of grandeur vanished immediately after. Hazel, your ever-opinionated horse, chose that exact moment to sneeze violently in your direction. Mud, straw, and horsey breath, your first blessing as a squire. Thomas snorted laughter from the sidelines. Even Sir Baldwin chuckled softly, shaking his head. Knighthood, he murmured, comes in stages. You've passed one. Many more await. Your responsibilities increased almost overnight. More direct training under knights, actual participation in military drills, and shadowing Sir Baldwin during formal events. It was thrilling and exhausting and occasionally ridiculous. One memorable task involved retrieving Sir Baldwin's boots from a particularly grumpy leatherworker, who insisted that only squire-worthy behavior, polite, persistent, and no flinching, would get you through the door. You succeeded after 3 attempts, a bruised ego, and one incident involving a runaway goose. Superstitions even followed the oath. Brother Anselm gifted you a charm, an acorn wrapped in red twine, meant to protect new squires from injury. He insisted it was tested. You weren't sure how, but you tucked it into your satchel anyway. That night, you lay awake longer than usual. The title of squire didn't magically make you more skilled or brave, but it felt like a promise, not just to others, but to yourself. To try harder, to be better, and maybe, someday, to stand where Sir Baldwin stood, hand on the shoulder of a new dreamer.
If the squire's oath had been your soul's commitment to the knightly path, then this next chapter was the penance your hands had to pay, chainmail. The romance of shining armor never mentions how horribly tedious chainmail is. It doesn't warn you about the blistered fingers or how heavy the thing is even before it's strapped on. And yet, there you were, hunched over a wooden bench in the smithy, squinting through torchlight, linking tiny iron rings together one painstaking twist at a time. Ka-chink, twist, ka-chink, twist. Try not to lose your mind. Sir Baldwin had given you the task himself. If you're to wear it, he said, you should understand what goes into making it. Every link is a lesson. Historically, he wasn't wrong. Chainmail, also called mal, was crafted by hand, link by link, sometimes taking months to produce a full hauberk. Knights either learned to make it, paid dearly for it, or leaned heavily on skilled smiths and armorers. And while the wealthy rarely forged their own, you, a squire of modest means, were introduced to the full monotony of the process. And the pain, oh, the pain. After just one afternoon, your fingertips were raw, muscles in your wrists screaming. You hadn't even made enough to cover your forearm. Thomas offered comic relief, claiming that if a knight's real enemy wasn't his opponent, it was early onset arthritis. Your assigned mentor in the forge was old Renrick, a blacksmith who seemed to communicate entirely through grunts and meaningful eyebrow raises. He watched you fumble and bleed, then silently handed you thicker gloves. Most squires quit, he finally muttered, nodding at your half-linked sheet. Some don't. Those ones usually end up worth something. One curious medieval belief Renrick shared, sprinkling holy water on unfinished armor, supposedly protected the wearer from both blades and bad luck. He said this casually while sipping something that smelled like fermented turnips. You made a mental note to double-check what he considered water. Historians still debate how common it was for squires to actually make their own mail. Some say it was rare, reserved for the particularly poor or determined. Others argue it was more common than romantic tales admit, a way to weed out the soft-handed dreamers. Whatever the truth, your hands were definitely no longer soft. But there was something meditative in it too. The rhythm, the clink, the way your mind wandered and cleared. You imagined yourself someday donning this very mail in battle, each link infused with a memory, a scar, a stubborn refusal to give up. And oh, the satisfaction when you finally completed a full sleeve. Renrick nodded once in approval. Try not to get stabbed in that arm. I like that one." You smiled, prouder than you'd been in weeks. That night, your hands ached so badly you could barely hold a spoon. Thomas helpfully offered to feed you porridge, then pretended to dump it on your head. You both laughed until it hurt, which didn't take long. Forging chainmail was a torment, but it taught you patience, respect for craftsmanship, and maybe even how to curse creatively without actually breaking your vow. Another step toward knighthood, one blistered knuckle at a time.
As if fashioning your own chainmail hadn't been humbling enough, your next great trial came in the form of a feast. Not the elegant kind whispered about in chivalric romances, but a loud, sprawling, barely controlled medieval dinner, where the food was strange, the rules were stranger, and you, of course, were tragically underprepared. The great hall was alight with torches and crammed with long wooden tables. Nobles, knights, and squires gathered to celebrate a minor victory involving sheep rustlers and a very confused goose. Everyone was in high spirits. You, however, were mostly in fear, for this would be your first official appearance at a formal banquet since taking your squire's oath. Thomas had tried to prep you. Don't eat too fast, don't reach across a noble, and whatever you do, don't mistake the centerpiece for an edible option. Sound advice, in theory. The meal began with a procession of servers bringing out trenchers, stale slabs of bread used as edible plates. You picked yours up cautiously, wondering if it was meant for holding food or perhaps defensive maneuvers. Your first real misstep came with the roasted peacock. Yes, peacock, fully feathered, beak included. It arrived in glorious display, plumes upright, eyes glazed over, you hoped with seasoning. You weren't sure whether to eat it, salute it, or apologize for whatever it had done to deserve this fate. You tried a bite. It tasted like pride and shoe leather. Historically, these feasts were as much about spectacle as sustenance. Dishes were elaborately presented to reflect wealth and status, even if they weren't particularly edible. Swan, hedgehog, and even porpoise were served on special occasions. Historians still argue how much was eaten versus admired, or quietly fed to dogs under the table. Then came the sauces, flavored with exotic spices like cloves and cinnamon, meant to disguise the age of meat rather than enhance it. You bravely dipped a hunk of game into a murky green sauce, which immediately made your eyes water and your tongue contemplate escape. And the table manners? A minefield. Spoons, you discovered, were for communal use. Diners often shared them, along with knives, bowls, and sometimes unsolicited stories of battle wounds. Thomas regaled the group with your moon-soaked sword story. Edmund nearly choked from laughing into his goblet. You made a final, nearly catastrophic mistake by attempting to stand and toast with the wrong cup, an ornate goblet belonging to Lady Celestine. Her eyes narrowed to a pinpoint glare that could shear steel. You froze mid-toast. She extended a slender hand to retrieve her goblet without a word. You sat down instantly, your soul exiting your body just briefly. Despite your bumbling, the evening ended with laughter, music, and merriment. A bard sang a comical ballad about a squire who tried to joust a windmill and lost to a sheep. You couldn't help but suspect someone had commissioned it on short notice. You left the feast exhausted, full of questionable meats and minor regrets. But you had survived, and in the strange theater of medieval dining, that was victory enough. The morning after the feast greeted you not with a noble sense of accomplishment, but with the sharp scent of vinegar and rust. Your next challenge was one you'd underestimated, keeping your armor from falling apart. Because apparently, polishing wasn't about aesthetics, it was survival.
Armor, for all its glorious clanking and heroic shimmer in bard songs, was needy, high maintenance, temperamental, like a cat that weighed 60 pounds and wanted to be carried everywhere. You were already intimately familiar with how uncomfortable it was to wear. Now you were about to discover how infuriating it was to maintain. Sir Baldwin assigned you a set of armor for regular care, a beat-up suit of chainmail and partial plate that had clearly seen more than one mud puddle and maybe a battle or two with an angry boar. You carried it to the armory bench in multiple trips, each clink and groan echoing your dread. Maintenance meant scrubbing off rust with vinegar, sand, and elbow grease. No shortcuts, no magic potions, just you, a cloth, and the slowly fraying remains of your will to live. You worked until your fingers went numb, your back ached, and the air smelled like a salad gone rogue. Historically, armor rust was a genuine problem. Knights had to keep their gear dry, oiled, and clean, no small task in a world without plastic tubs or WD-40. Some even wore linen underclothes soaked in wax to reduce sweat buildup, which was debatably effective and definitely unpleasant. Brother Anselm passed by at one point, offering you a pungent mixture of lard and crushed garlic, allegedly an ancient anti-rust remedy. You politely declined, not wishing to smell like a roasted dinner entree for the next week. He simply shrugged and rubbed it onto his own boots. The strange part was, after hours of scrubbing and oiling, you started to enjoy it, just a little. There was something calming about the repetitive motion, something satisfying in watching dull metal gleam again under your hands. Edmund even muttered a compliment, which you assumed meant you were doing well, or maybe he just liked the smell of vinegar. But the work also gave you time to think, to reflect. Armor wasn't just protection, it was metaphor. Layers of effort, weight carried, maintenance required. You began to see the romance of it, not in the spotless gleam, but in the quiet commitment it took to keep it whole. Historians still argue whether knights did their own maintenance or left it to squires and servants. Truthfully, it was probably a mix, but you suspected any knight worth his salt knew how to care for the tools that kept him alive. One afternoon, Thomas walked in to find you humming while polishing a breastplate. He stared for a moment, then said, "You've officially gone mad, haven't you?" You looked up, smiling, just trying to keep the rust off. He nodded gravely. A metaphor, if I've ever heard one. That night, you laid your armor out with pride. It wasn't perfect, but it was clean, oiled, and ready. You knew every scratch, every dent, every newly brightened link, and they knew you. Knight and armor, still separate for now, but beginning to understand each other. You always thought knightly duties involved glorious battles and noble rescues. What you didn't expect was the dizzying maze of alliances, negotiations, and courtly politics. Turns out, a knight spent almost as much time managing relationships as they did sharpening swords. And sometimes, unfortunately, they did both at once. The first hint came during an afternoon in the Solar, a sunlit chamber where Lord Erwin met with visiting nobles and minor lords to discuss matters you could barely pretend to understand. You were there to assist Sir Baldwin, mostly standing quietly and trying to look taller than you felt. The talk of land disputes, grain shortages, and tax exemptions made your head spin. Then came the moment Sir Baldwin leaned down and whispered, "Watch carefully. This is where a knight's tongue does more than his blade." That day, you observed the true art of diplomacy, veiled compliments, carefully worded requests, and smiles that didn't reach the eyes. It was like swordplay, but the daggers were verbal, and the wounds took longer to heal.
You saw noblemen agree to terms neither truly supported, and women in silk dresses navigate social traps more deftly than any mounted knight. Historically, diplomacy was indeed a vital part of knighthood, especially as knights rose in rank or served as advisors. Negotiating alliances through marriage, land grants, or shared military support was routine. Some knights served as ambassadors, their reputations balancing on a word as much on a blade. Of course, it wasn't all charm and poetry. One visiting knight, Sir Orlin of Hargrave, tried to secure favor by gifting Lord Erwin a falcon. The falcon, naturally, escaped mid-ceremony and latched onto a tapestry, refusing to descend. Chaos ensued. You helped corner the bird with Thomas using a blanket and 2 candlesticks. It was less than graceful. That incident earned you unexpected praise for innovative tactical coordination, and Lord Erwin even chuckled. Still, diplomacy remained a delicate art. You began practicing in smaller ways, mediating squabbles between younger pages, settling a minor kitchen dispute about pie allocation, serious business, and even apologizing to Edmund for a sarcastic comment about his hair. A true trial. Brother Anselm, ever helpful, gifted you a small book of medieval omens. "Read people like you read stars," he advised cryptically. The book was filled with useful nuggets, like, "If a noble scratches his ear, he is displeased," and "Avoid agreements on days of uneven numbers." You skimmed it, briefly. Historians still argue over how much medieval diplomacy was based on genuine cooperation versus pure manipulation. From what you saw, the truth lived somewhere in between. Knights had to juggle loyalty, reputation, and ambition in a world where alliances could change faster than you could say tax dispute. One evening, as you practiced polite greetings in front of a mirror, Thomas walked in and offered this gem. You could charm a goose into giving you its eggs, but maybe keep your metaphors under control. You rolled your eyes, but deep down, you were beginning to understand. Diplomacy was just another weapon, a quiet one, maybe, but no less dangerous. And if you were to wear the mantle of knighthood, you'd have to master this as well. Even if it meant chasing the occasional falcon through polite society.
You thought jousting was hard. Then you met falconry. Lord Erwin, in a moment of what he probably believed was generosity, assigned you and Thomas to assist with the noble pastime of falconry. It sounded elegant enough, training birds of prey to hunt on command. In theory, very knightly. In practice, an exercise in feathered humiliation. Your charge was a young peregrine falcon named Elric, named, apparently, after some long-dead relative of Lord Erwin. Elric had the sharp-eyed stare of someone who had already judged your soul and found it sorely lacking. On the first day, he clawed his perch, glared at you, and promptly tried to fly directly into Thomas's face. It did not inspire confidence. The falconer, Master Harwin, was a wiry man with a perpetual squint and the patience of a monk. He handed you a leather glove and said, "He doesn't like loud noises, or sudden movements, or most people. Good luck." Training involved hooding and unhooding the falcon, whistling commands, and offering treats, usually bits of rabbit or quail. Elric, naturally, ignored all instructions. Instead, he stared pointedly in the opposite direction, sometimes relieving himself on your boot for emphasis. Historically, falconry was a beloved noble pastime in medieval Europe, requiring years of skill to master. Knights used falcons for both hunting and social standing. Showing off one's bird was akin to flashing a custom sports carriage. Different birds indicated different ranks. A peregrine, for example, was considered suitable for a knight. In your case,
Elric was apparently only suitable for chaos. You and Thomas spent hours each day walking the fields, releasing and retrieving birds, trying not to lose one permanently in the woods. You came close. Your arms ached, your gloves smelled like raw meat, and you gained a newfound respect for anyone who could keep one of these birds from flying into the sun out of spite. One afternoon, Elric actually returned to your glove after a successful flight. Master Harwin blinked in disbelief. "He likes you," he said, as though it was the worst possible outcome. You weren't sure whether to be flattered or deeply concerned. Brother Ansem, ever the font of bizarre information, once informed you that medieval people believed falcons could see into the future. "They sense storms before they happen," he said with a sage nod, "and court betrayals." You stared at Elric. He sneezed on your sleeve. Ominous. Historians still debate whether falconry was primarily symbolic or truly practical. There's evidence it was both. A means of bonding with nature, of showcasing status, and occasionally, yes, catching dinner. For you, it was mostly about dodging talons and keeping your dignity intact. Despite the frustration, falconry offered something surprising: quiet. Out in the meadows, with only the rustle of grass and the rush of wings above, you found moments of peace. Elric might be temperamental, but when he soared, he did so with purpose, power, freedom. You started to understand the appeal. A knight's life was about control, of self, of sword, of duty. But falconry was about trust, letting go, hoping the creature returned. Maybe, in some way, that was knighthood too. And hey, Elric only pooped on you once that week. Definite progress.
Victory didn't come in a trumpet blast or on the back of a white steed. No, your first real moment of triumph snuck up on you in the middle of a dusty tournament, with one gauntlet half loose and your heart hammering like a blacksmith's hammer. It began as most tournaments did, with excessive fanfare, clashing colors, and someone dramatically fainting from heat before the event even started. Lord Irwin had invited neighboring nobles to watch the squires display their progress. For once, Edmund wasn't the center of attention. Today, the matches were chosen at random. Your name was drawn. Opponent, Sir Ulric's squire, a broad-shouldered lad named Hugo, who looked like he could wrestle a cow and win compliments for style. You tried not to panic. Sir Baldwin gave you a steady look. Trust your training, and remember, grace is more impressive than brute force. He paused, though force helps. The bout was with wooden swords, of course, and armor was limited to padded gambesons and helmets, but your palms still sweated as you stepped into the ring, the crowd blurring into color and noise. Historically, squire-level tournaments were both training and performance, meant to hone skills and give nobles a glimpse of rising talent. Some were formalized melees, others messy free-for-alls resembling angry barnyard brawls. Yours landed somewhere in between. You and Hugo saluted each other. Then he charged. You parried, not well, but just enough. The shock of contact jarred your arm. Then another strike. You ducked the third. Your mind went blank, instincts taking over. Stance, swing, pivot. Your weeks of training whispered through your limbs. It wasn't elegant, it wasn't fast, but it was yours. After what felt like a lifetime, you landed a clean strike on Hugo's shoulder. He stumbled, lost footing, and fell backwards into the hay. Silence. Then cheering. You blinked in disbelief. Sir Baldwin gave a small nod from the sidelines, the knightly equivalent of a standing ovation. Thomas cheered like a bard paid in bread. Even Edmund offered a respectful, if begrudging, clap. It wasn't a grand victory, not in the way bards would sing, but it was real. Yours. Honest and earned. Your limbs ached, your helmet stank, and your sword arm felt like jelly, but your grin stretched all the way back to Eldergrove. Later that evening, around a fire pit, the squires replayed the day's matches. Your win was recounted 3 times, gaining flair with each retelling. In one version, you dodged Hugo's sword mid-air. In another, you caught it and handed it back politely. You didn't correct them. Historians debate how often young squires were given real chances to shine. Most agree opportunities were rare and often political. But occasionally, a well-timed match and a steady grip could open eyes and doors. As the fire crackled and the stars blinked lazily above, you ran a finger along the edge of your training sword. For the first time, you truly believed knighthood wasn't just a far-off dream. It was a path you were walking. One battle, one blister, one wooden sword at a time. And tomorrow? Well, you'd be sore. But tonight, you were triumphant.
Just when you thought you might be getting the hang of this whole squire thing, swordplay, horse handling, even the occasional successful falcon flight, you were blindsided by a far more perilous terrain: romance. It began innocently enough at a spring festival hosted by Lord Irwin. The courtyard was transformed into a riot of color and music. Garlands hung from the stone arches, and minstrels wandered with lutes, serenading anyone too polite to run. Nobles from neighboring holdings had arrived in droves, including several eligible daughters, who, quite frankly, seemed more terrifying than any sparring match. One in particular, Lady Isolde, caught your eye, and the edge of your shoe as you tripped while attempting an impressively awkward bow. She laughed, thankfully not unkindly, and offered her hand. You tried to remember all your etiquette lessons. You only managed about half of them. "Charmed," you muttered, accidentally stepping on the hem of her gown. Romantic customs in the medieval period were, well, a production. Courtly love demanded poetry, stoic longing, and a level of emotional restraint usually reserved for extremely repressed statues. Knights often composed verses for ladies they'd never even spoken to, then rode off dramatically into the sunset, sometimes literally, sometimes just to escape the consequences. Historians debate how much of courtly love was genuinely practiced and how much was literary fantasy penned by overly imaginative troubadours. From your perspective, it was a confusing blend of both. You were now expected to flirt using metaphors about roses, moons, and loyalty, all while balancing a goblet and not knocking over decorative tapestries. Thomas, naturally, was thrilled. "You need a poem," he declared. "Something heartfelt, something bold." You tried. Truly. Your first attempt rhymed armor with farmer and referred to Lady Isolde's eyes as twinkling like slightly damp candles. Thomas wept tears of laughter. Even Elric the Falcon looked disappointed. Nevertheless, Lady Isolde remained gracious. She even complimented your attempt. "Uniquely charming," she said. You weren't sure if that was good, but she smiled when she said it, so you held on to that. One fringe belief Brother Anselm shared involved love potions made from rosewater and powdered dove's heart, supposedly ensuring affection. You chose not to pursue that recipe. Just having to say dove's heart out loud felt like a crime. Still, the whole experience gave you new perspective. Love wasn't something you could train for. It was unpredictable, awkward, occasionally poetic, and oddly humbling. You suddenly understood why knights sometimes rode into battle with a lady's favor tied to their lance, not because it made them stronger, but because it reminded them of something worth returning to. As the festival faded and duties resumed, you tucked away your scribbled poem, draft number 6, less humiliating, and continued training with a slight spring in your step. Maybe it was Isolde's laugh, or maybe the sheer absurdity of medieval romance. Either way, you learned something vital. Knighthood required more than discipline and steel. It required heart,
even if that heart occasionally expressed itself through questionable rhymes and wardrobe-related accidents. And if nothing else, you could always blame the candle metaphor on exhaustion.
Your poetic detour into the world of courtly love had left you giddy, embarrassed, and slightly lightheaded, but not half as much as your next lesson in medieval reality: medicine. It began, as these things tend to, with a poorly timed foot injury. You were helping Thomas lift a crate of salted fish. Don't ask why it was heavy, don't ask why it was in the stables, when the crate slipped and landed directly on your foot. There was a crunch, followed by a sound that might have been your soul exiting your body. You hobbled dramatically to the infirmary, where you were promptly greeted by Mistress Brangane, the castle's resident healer. She was spry, sharp-eyed, and had the bedside manner of a grumpy rooster. "Take off your boot," she ordered. You obeyed. That was your first mistake. She wrinkled her nose. "You call this a clean foot? You've brought the plague into my infirmary." A bit of an exaggeration. What followed was an eye-opening journey through medieval medicine. Mistress Brangane pulled out a collection of tools and jars, ointments made of goose fat and mustard, leeches swimming lazily in a bowl, and a paste made from crushed sage and, apparently, chicken droppings. You prayed that last one was metaphorical. Historically, medieval medical practices were a curious mix of practical herbalism and deeply questionable theories based on the four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Ailments were often attributed to imbalances in these fluids. Stubbed your toe? Clearly an excess of black bile. Headache? Too much wind in the brain. Brother Anselm, who of course appeared during your treatment, added cheerfully, "You're lucky they're not bleeding you. Yet." You did, in fact, avoid leech therapy, but not by much. Brangane instead applied a pungent salve and wrapped your foot tightly in linen, then handed you a small cloth bundle to bite whenever the pain surged. "Just scream into that. It's dignified." The experience was both horrifying and educational. You gained a new respect for those who endured worse injuries, and a particularly cautious appreciation for stable-related chores. Even Edmund visited, mostly to laugh at your limp, but offered a half-decent story about a knight who once treated a broken arm with beer and positive thinking. You suspected this was mostly beer. One fringe belief Brangane shared, more in jest you hoped, involved placing a hedgehog's spine beneath your pillow to draw out pain. You opted for another dose of goose fat salve. Historians continued debating whether medieval medicine actually helped more than it hurt. Some argue that herbal remedies were surprisingly effective, especially when handled by experienced women like Brangane. Others point to the excessive use of bloodletting and, well, chicken-based solutions. You limped for days, slower in the training yard, but sharper in observation. You watched how others handled pain, how knights gritted their teeth through wounds, how pages whispered old prayers when faced with illness. There was bravery not just in battle, but in enduring the ordinary aches and indignities that came with a hard life. By the end of the week, your foot was healing. Slowly, yes, but without feathers growing from it, which you took as a win. And as Thomas helped you hobble to dinner, he clapped you on the back and said, "Next time, let's drop the fish on Edmund." Tempting. Very tempting. Your foot had barely healed when the next challenge arrived, less a lesson, more a brutal refresher course in humility, a full-scale siege training exercise, revisited with more complexity, more chaos, and this time a distinctly less forgiving weather pattern. Rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the practice grounds into a muddy quagmire. The wooden palisades that once looked theatrical now loomed like wheel fortifications. Tents flapped wildly in the wind. You stood beside Thomas, soaked, armor cold against your skin, clutching your sword like it might float you to safety. This time, you were on the defending team. Sir Baldwin's voice cut through the storm. "Hold the gate. Hold your nerve. Hold your tongue, Cale." That last part earned a few chuckles. Siege warfare, historically, was a grinding, miserable ordeal. Defenders lived in cramped conditions, often short on supplies, sleep, and morale. They dropped stones, poured boiling water or oil, and braced constantly for breaches. Diseases ran rampant. The real thing could last weeks, months even. Thankfully, your version was confined to 2 days and an exceptionally wet tunic. The attacking force, led by Edmund, of course, came with siege towers made of repurposed cart frames and ladders lashed together with fraying rope. You secretly hoped he'd fall off one, just once, purely for dramatic effect. Alas, he remained irritably balanced. Defending required stamina, coordination, and shouting over both rain and battle cries. You helped reinforce barricades, dodged mock arrows made from padded shafts, and attempted to pour barrels of water onto a ladder-climbing squad without accidentally dousing your own team. You mostly succeeded. Thomas, ever the improviser, weaponized a tray of cold porridge as a projectile. For morale, he claimed. Theirs, not ours. One particularly intense moment saw you on the ramparts, locking wooden blades with an attacker. Your foot slipped. You went down. Mud to the face. But then, instinct again, you rolled, regained footing, and knocked your opponent backward. The cheer that followed, though waterlogged, was deeply satisfying. At night, the defenders huddled in makeshift quarters, steam rising from soaked clothes in stew pots. They shared stories, shivered together, and realized that camaraderie in siege conditions wasn't just a luxury, it was a lifeline. Brother Ansem visited briefly with his usual brand of questionable wisdom. A toad buried in the wall brings good fortune to defenders. You nodded solemnly. You were far too tired to argue with amphibian logic. Historians debate whether these medieval siege rituals, burying charms, painting symbols on gates, had real spiritual significance or were just desperate hope clung to in brutal times. Based on the intensity of your muddy struggle, you could understand why people wanted any edge they could get, even if it came with webbed feet. By the end of the siege exercise, the walls held, barely. You limped back into the hall, drenched, bruised, but glowing. Sir Baldwin gave a rare grin. Now that, he said, was closer to the real thing, and none of you died. Impressive. You didn't feel noble, you felt like a wet sack of oats, but you also felt unbreakable. One more test passed, one step closer.
Fame, it turned out, was both thrilling and utterly exhausting. After the muddy siege spectacle and your unexpected moment of heroism on the ramparts, word spread faster than Elric on a caffeine rush. Pages whispered, servants nodded. Even a few knights started remembering your name without asking Thomas first. And that was the beginning of your problems. Suddenly, you were being called on for demonstrations. Lady Celestine requested your presence at court, not for etiquette correction this time, but to inspire the younger pages. You stood awkwardly before them, trying to deliver a stirring speech, while Thomas mouthed the word dignity behind their backs like a theatrical ghost. Then came the requests. A merchant wanted you to endorse his new line of boot oil, worn by Cale the Wallholder. Edmund nearly choked when he saw the prototype poster. You didn't approve it, obviously, but the boots were oddly comfortable. And with recognition came expectation. Sir Baldwin began assigning you more responsibilities, overseeing drills,
assisting with evaluations, even speaking on behalf of the squires in occasional court sessions. It felt good to be trusted. It also felt like juggling with swords. Historically, the fame of a knight often came at the cost of privacy and personal time. Tournaments created celebrities. Tales spread by bards cemented reputations, sometimes wildly exaggerated. Knights were expected to maintain not just strength, but image. And once you had one, it needed constant polishing, like armor, only more fragile. You were discovering that truth firsthand. People began noticing when you were late or tired, or when your once polished armor had a suspicious mustard stain from a rushed lunch. Your quiet moments became rare, your expectations inflated. Thomas, ever your anchor, noticed. "You need to vanish for a day," he suggested. "I know a place, no posters, no peacocks, no Edmund." It was a tiny glen beyond the orchard, where the trees whispered but didn't judge. You and Thomas spent the afternoon lying in the grass, tossing stones into a creek and talking nonsense. Elric perched nearby, chewing on something unidentifiable. Probably another poster. Brother Anselm joined briefly, saying nothing, then left a scroll of philosophical poems tied with red twine. You burned it later, purely for the ambiance. One fringe belief shared that week, the notion that if too many people praised a knight too often, it might attract the evil eye. A charm of braided horsehair was supposed to counteract this. You didn't believe it, but you wore the braid anyway. Quiet superstition, just in case. Historians still debate how sustainable a knight's fame really was, or whether it led to downfall as often as glory. After your brief taste, you began to see the tension, the cost of being seen, the burden of becoming a symbol when all you wanted was to finish your stew before it got cold. Eventually, things settled. A new tournament arrived. A new squire bested an old rival. The spotlight shifted, as it always does. But you didn't mind. You'd had your moment, and you knew now that being admired wasn't the same as being fulfilled. Real knighthood wasn't in the posters. It was in the glen, the muddy ramparts, the sore hands after training. Quiet things, unseen, mostly, but not forgotten.
It wasn't long after your brush with fleeting fame that Sir Baldwin called you into the armory with an expression so serious you briefly wondered if you'd accidentally jousted a noble's dog. Instead, he handed you a thick roll of parchment, a box of colored pigments, and a heavy sigh. "Heraldry," he said. "It's time." Ah, yes, your coat of arms. That magical, confusing blend of colors, creatures, and symbols that was supposed to represent your very soul, squashed into a shield and painted onto anything that didn't move fast enough. You unrolled the parchment. Dozens of sketches stared back at you. Lions, boars, chevrons, stars, and geometric shapes that looked suspiciously like abstract chickens. Thomas peered over your shoulder. "Ooh, that one looks like a goose attacking a wheel of cheese. Noble." Designing a coat of arms was no small matter. Historically, heraldry was a powerful tool, a knight's visual identity, used on battlefields, tournaments, and legal documents. The language was surprisingly formal, full of terms like argent for silver, gules for red, and passant guardant for a lion walking while giving side-eye. Brother Anselm, who naturally appeared at the worst possible moment, added that certain symbols carried deep meaning. Bears represented strength. Falcons, he nodded at Elric, symbolized keen vision. A hedgehog, he said solemnly, symbolizes self-preservation. Thomas snorted. The challenge wasn't just picking something cool. It had to feel true. You thought of including a sword, but it felt obvious. A tree? Perhaps, for roots and growth. You even briefly considered a scroll, nodding to your studies and courtly missteps. In the end, you settled on a simple design, a silver oak tree on a field of dark blue, roots exposed. Strong, honest, unpretentious. Sir Baldwin studied it for a long moment. Then he nodded. Unusual, but fitting. Coming from him, this was high praise. Next came painting it onto your shield, a delicate process involving clunky brushes, slippery pigment, and an unexpected sneeze that resulted in a silver smudge across your tunic. Thomas offered to help, promptly dipped the brush into the wrong pot, and nearly added a bright pink rabbit to the corner. You shooed him away. One peculiar belief from the armory scrolls was that mispainted heraldry was a sign of future misfortune in battle. Apparently, a knight once rode into war with his lion upside down and fell off his horse before reaching the enemy line. You carefully double-checked your oak. Historians still debate how much of heraldry's symbolism was truly understood by the wider public. To some, it was a noble language. To others, just fancy decoration. But for you, it became something deeper, a marker of your journey, your values, your roots. That night, you sat beside your shield, drying slowly near the fire, and studied it with a quiet sort of pride. You hadn't earned a title yet, you weren't a knight, but you had a symbol now. Something of your own. Looks good, Thomas said, nudging you. But you know Edmund's adding a dragon and a falcon? Very subtle. You laughed. Let him. Mine tells the truth. And that, somehow, felt more knightly than any number of creatures breathing fire on silk banners ever could.
It came with no trumpet, no scroll, no grand announcement. Just a quiet nod from Sir Baldwin after supper, and the simple instruction: tonight, the vigil. Your mouth went dry. The vigil, a night's silent night of prayer and reflection before the dubbing ceremony. It was part tradition, part rite of passage, and entirely daunting. You'd heard tales, how some squires fasted, others wept, and a few fell asleep and woke up to a very disappointed night and a missed opportunity. No pressure. You dressed simply, a clean tunic, bare feet on cold stone. The chapel was candlelit, still, and scented faintly of beeswax and lavender. Outside, the wind whispered like an old friend. Inside, time itself seemed to slow. Traditionally, this vigil was sacred. Knights in the making would stay awake through the night, meditating on their journey, failures, triumphs, and the weight of the vow to come. It wasn't about spectacle, it was about honesty. And for the first time in your long, bruising climb toward knighthood, there were no sparring partners, no rivals, no audiences. Just you. You knelt before the altar. Your sword, freshly polished, lay across the stone, gleaming faintly in the candlelight. Your shield rested nearby, oak tree and roots calm and strong. You placed your hand upon it. The gesture felt grounding. Memories drifted in. Your parents in Elder Grove, faces weathered but proud. Thomas, tossing pebbles into a stream, teasing you about your poetry. Edmund, smirking as always, but more recently with a flicker of respect in his eyes. Lady Isolde's gentle laugh, Elric's unimpressed squawk. even Brother Ansem muttering about goat entrails and cosmic balance. You thought of the boy who once dreamed of armor while chasing chickens barefoot, of muddy tournaments, failed feasts, blisters, and chainmail-induced back spasms, of how close you'd come to quitting, how often you doubted, and how, somehow, despite everything, you were still here. One historical note Sir Baldwin had shared weeks ago lingered. In earlier times, knights wore white during the vigil to symbolize purity, then red for courage, then black for mortality. It reminded them what was at stake. You weren't in ceremonial colors, but the sentiment wrapped around you like a second cloak. Historians debate whether the vigil was always taken seriously, or if it eventually became symbolic, more pageantry than piety. But as hours crept forward and the chapel held its hush, there was no pretending, not for you. You whispered a few clumsy prayers, not because you feared punishment, but because it felt right to speak into the silence. Promises to be better, to protect, to keep learning, to never lose the humility born in sweat and stumbles. You didn't sleep. You didn't want to. The stillness became its own kind of armor. The candles burned low. The stars outside dimmed and blinked. Morning waited on the edge of the world. You weren't a knight yet, but by dawn you would rise with a heart steadied by reflection, anchored by memory. And for all the battles ahead, you'd always remember this night, the one you passed not in glory, but in quiet readiness, and hopefully without snoring.
Dawn didn't just break, it poured. Gold light spilled through the chapel windows, melting the shadows you'd sat with all night. The chill receded. The hush lifted. The world stirred, and so did you. Sir Baldwin entered silently, nodding once, eyes scanning you for signs of sleep or doubt. He found none. You stood slowly, bones creaking in protest, but something inside you had gone very still. Not frozen, just calm, like the surface of a lake moments before the wind returns. "Come," he said. What followed was not a parade, but a procession. Pages, squires, knights. Lord Irwin himself. The hall had been transformed. Banners draped like proud arms. Floor swept clean enough to reflect torchlight. The scent of sage and lemon balm filling the air. You walked between rows of your peers, some grinning, some solemn. Thomas gave you a thumbs up that was somehow both ridiculous and deeply reassuring. At the front waited the altar, your sword resting upon it. Beside it, a ceremonial blade, older, inscribed, once wielded by a knight whose name had long since slipped from record, but whose honor had not. The dubbing ceremony began. Traditionally, knighthood was bestowed with a ritual that varied across regions, but always held weight. Sometimes it included a symbolic blow, a gentle strike to the shoulder or cheek to remind the knight never to dishonor the title. Sometimes there were oaths, relics, or even holy relics involved. But always there was intention. You knelt. Sir Baldwin stepped forward. He lifted the blade. "In the name of chivalry, courage, and service," he said, voice carrying across the hall, "I dub thee knight." He tapped each shoulder with the flat of the blade. "Rise, Sir Kale." You did, slowly. The name
echoed strangely in your ears, as though it belonged to someone else, and yet it fit, like a well-worn gauntlet finally returning to its rightful hand. The hall erupted. Applause, cheers, a whistle you were 99% sure came from Thomas. Edmund clapped once, polite, curt, but genuine. You were led to a small platform where your sword, shield, and spurs awaited. The spurs clicked into place, the sword belt fastened at your hip. The shield, your tree and roots, was lifted and placed against your arm with ceremonial precision. Brother Anselm approached last. He offered no cryptic saying, no herbal charm, just a firm grip on your shoulder and a quiet, "Well done." One odd custom you'd read about in your squire days: in some regions, knights were given a symbolic kiss of peace. In yours, thankfully, this had been modernized into a hearty handshake and a very large breakfast. Historians still debate whether the gravity of these ceremonies was always felt, or if, over time, it became pomp without pulse. But as you looked around the room, at the warmth in your companions' faces, the pride on Lord Irwin's, and the subtle mist in Sir Baldwin's eyes, you knew this was real. Not because of the sword, not because of the spurs, because you had earned every scrape, every stumble, every story. And now, finally, the name. You were a knight.
The morning after your knighting ceremony dawned bright, crisp, and disarmingly normal. You half expected trumpets, or maybe a magical glow, at least a slightly more flattering reflection in the water basin. But no. You woke up groggy, with hair stuck to one side of your face and your ceremonial cloak bunched under your arm like a slightly judgmental cat. Still, you were a knight now, which meant new responsibilities. You began your day with a quick polish of your sword, a task that now carried a quiet gravity. It wasn't just a training tool anymore. It was a symbol, a promise. Though Thomas, ever the realist, still called it your very shiny, very pointy friend. Your first official duty? Escorting a visiting noble's caravan halfway to the next province. Not exactly dragon slaying, but important nonetheless. You dressed in full gear, adjusted your spurs, and tried to walk like you knew what you were doing. Spoiler, the spurs jingled far more than expected. One page started humming every time you passed. The caravan was unexciting. Muddy roads, occasional sheep blockades, and one of the noble's daughters attempting to write a poem about the clouds out loud while riding. It rhymed sky with pie 3 times. You tried not to cry. Historically, most knights didn't jump straight into epic quests post-ceremony. They performed mundane tasks, guarding borders, managing land, attending court, and yes, enduring awkward conversations during travel. Their glory came not from immediate adventure, but from dependable service. You were beginning to understand that. Halfway through the journey, a wheel broke. While squires scrambled to fetch help, you found yourself kneeling in the mud, helping lift a wagon axle, sweat streaking your polished armor. A farmer passed by, nodded politely, and said, "Good lad. Squire?" You smiled and corrected him. "Knight." He blinked. "Ah, same boots though." By the time you returned, boots ruined and pride slightly deflated, Lord Irwin welcomed you with a nod and a scroll. More assignments, more travel, more service. You thought about all the stories you'd heard growing up, how knighthood meant being adored, applauded, immortalized in song. But here you were, quietly accepted into duty without fanfare. And strangely, it felt right. You were no longer becoming. You simply were. One quirky belief you'd recently heard from Brother Anselm: it was bad luck to sleep the night after being knighted, lest your dreams steal part of your courage.
You'd laughed, then promptly fallen asleep anyway. You dreamt of trees, roots, a quiet chapel. Historians still debate whether the transition from squire to knight felt momentous or gradual for those who lived it. For you, it was both. A single moment sealed with a sword tap, and then 100 small ones that followed, asking if you'd live up to it. That night, back in your quarters, you unbuckled your armor slowly. The weight was familiar now. Welcome. You set your sword aside gently, fingers brushing the edge of your shield. You had not saved a kingdom, but you had mended a cart, lifted an axle, worn your name with quiet pride. And really, wasn't that where knighthood began? Not with dragons, but with duty. Not with songs, but with service. Tomorrow would come with mud and noise. Tonight, though, you rested.
Years passed, though you rarely noticed them. One day melted into the next, riding between villages, negotiating disputes, training new squires who reminded you so much of yourself it hurt. And then one evening, you found yourself standing at the edge of Eldergrove again. The forest still whispered, the trees still bowed in the wind, and the apple tree you once climbed as a barefoot child now bent under the weight of fruit, just as it had when you first dreamed of armor and dragons. A small crowd had gathered, a new crop of wide-eyed children. They watched you with a reverence that caught you off guard. You chuckled softly, kneeling down to let them touch your gauntlet. It wasn't shining anymore, just polished enough, worn, used, honest. One boy asked, "Were you scared?" You thought about everything. The chainmail, the falcons, the tournament nerves, the poetry, the foot injury, the sauce bowl. All the time, you said, but I didn't let it stop me. And just like that, the circle felt complete. The next morning, you wrote a letter to Lord Irwin, requesting that your current squire, bright, stubborn, and poetic, be considered for the next vigil. You signed it with a name that no longer felt borrowed, Sir Cale. And now, here you are again, not as the eager child peering into the forge, nor the trembling squire fumbling with armor buckles, but something softer, something steadier. The path to knighthood wasn't paved with applause or clean victories. It was shaped by scraped knees, quiet oaths, and the silent knowledge that you kept going when no one was watching. There's a kind of peace in that, a slow, deep breath sort of peace, like warm bread after a cold ride, like soft moss beneath a tree, like the weight of armor lifted, not because the battle is over, but because you know who you are without it. You can rest now. You've earned that. So let the torches fade. Let the sword rest. Let your breathing fall into rhythm with the hush of wind outside your window. You're not chasing knighthood anymore. You've become it. Good night, Cale.